Alright, so we have a modern remake of the 80s classic Roadhouse, and the plot for it is pretty much this. Ex-UFC fighter Dalton takes a job as a bouncer at a Florida Keys Roadhouse, only to discover that his paradise is not at all what it seems. Alright, let's get into the good parts of this movie, and the first thing I'm going to say is that Jake Gyllenhaal is really good here. He's been one of the best actors for like the past 10 to 15 years now, and it shows here. This character doesn't really have a lot going on, at least in terms of writing, but he makes it a very interesting and somewhat compelling character. He's a UFC fighter, like I said in the plot description, but he actually has a lot that he's dealing with, especially with his last fight that he had. But once again, this movie makes it a point to make us know that he's really dealing with some stuff in this movie in terms of that last fight, and although we don't get to see his overall career, I still think it was pretty interesting to see. Although at times it did feel like the UFC segments were kind of shoehorned into the movie. The next thing that I liked about this movie is that it's shot very well. We get to see a lot of beautiful shots and silhouettes of Florida. And Florida is actually a very nice place to look at. I never realized that because everything I hear about Florida is usually not a good thing. But it feels like at times this movie's budget, like half of it was just Florida landscape shots, and honestly I don't blame them because once again, it's really nice to look at. The next thing that I liked about this movie is Conor McGregor. I was somewhat interested in this movie because it had Jake Gyllenhaal and UFC involved, but at the same time it wasn't enough for me to really care. But when I saw Conor McGregor in that trailer for the first time, I knew that I definitely had to watch it. And he did not disappoint. That first scene with Conor McGregor in this movie, if you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. Now that's a way to start a film career. And at times he kind of feels like he's like a Arnold Schwarzenegger 80s, 90s action hero with some of the one-liners he's using. Which for certain people, this movie is going to be a little bit too cartoonish and goofy at times, especially that second half when Conor comes in. But for someone like me, that worked perfectly. And he's also just genuinely funny in this movie for me as well. But aside from that, Conor McGregor's acting isn't really needed for anything like serious or dramatic, but he is a really good comedic actor, and I would love to see him in more stuff in the future. And the last thing I'll say before I get into my criticisms for this movie is that the action is really great, and there's a certain style that this movie goes for which kind of feels like a video game at times. And there's a lot of camera movement and a certain camera movement for the entire movie, and it's kind of like a pan-in Dutch angle kind of shot that they're doing for the entire movie, and it works for like 90% of the movie, especially that final sequence between Conor McGregor and Jake Gyllenhaal, but at times it does feel like it's overused. And it could have benefited from having better angles at times, and honestly just not having to move the camera at times and just letting the actors fight, because there is some really good choreography here, and at times I can't fully see it because of the way the camera is moving. But let's get into the criticisms for this movie, and the first thing I didn't like was Daniela, sorry if I mispronounced this, but Malchoy. But Jake Gyllenhaal and her have really good chemistry in this movie, but once again, the writing for this movie just doesn't really work for me at all. Because the movie's not really about that romantic side of the film, it's more so about Jake Gyllenhaal versus these like guys who want to take over the Roadhouse. So there's not a lot of time left for Jake and Daniela, so that was kind of a bummer for me. Another criticism that I have for this movie is that the other villains for this film aside from McGregor are just kind of one note. And I guess you could say Conor McGregor's character in this movie is also pretty one note, but he's just very entertaining to watch, so I let it go. Mo was also another cool character in this film. He just rides motorcycles really. He doesn't seem to care about the business side of their motorcycle gang. But aside from that, everyone else in this film is just kind of one note and kind of boring at times and just uninteresting, honestly. We don't even get to see the dad for the film, which was kind of a bummer and kind of surprising at the same time because they keep talking about the dad, but we don't really see him. Obviously, he's in prison, but like not even like a little shot of him. I thought that was kind of weird. But the biggest problem I have with this movie is probably the pacing. Because a lot of the issues I have with this movie are stuff that a lot of you are not going to care about. And if this movie was about 20 to 30 minutes shorter, I think I would have let a lot of these go. But after the first half of this movie, there's about 20 to 30 minutes where I definitely feel like it could have been cut out. And the movie loses a lot of steam for me because the first half was really good. And not to say the second half is not good either, but because of the poor pacing, it feels like this movie kind of just doesn't work for me overall. So overall, Roadhouse is a pretty fun movie. If you watched the trailer and didn't like it, you're probably not going to like the movie. But if you watched the trailer the way that I did, thinking that it's going to be a good time, I think you're actually going to think it's a good time, honestly. So overall, I'm going to give Roadhouse a 6.75 out of 10. It's definitely one of the most fun movies we got this year, but it's definitely not one of the best. Let me know in the comments, what did you think about it? And those are my thoughts on that.